The rain that afternoon fell softly, painting the world in shades of silver and silence. The scent of wet grass drifted through the open window of the rehabilitation center, where Lee sat quietly on a wooden bench, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't know why, but every time it rained, something inside him stirred a faint ache, a whisper of something lost.
Lee had been living there for nearly 6 months, recovering from a head injury after an explosion during his mission abroad. His body healed faster than his mind. His memories were like broken pieces of glass, scattered, sharp, and impossible to put together. Every time the doctor asked him if he remembered anyone special, he would smile faintly and shake his head. "I feel like someone is waiting," he once said, "but I don't know who."
That same day, fate brought someone back into his life. Sam arrived at the rehabilitation center holding a small umbrella, her belly round and gentle beneath her long beige coat. Her heart was pounding, and her steps trembled slightly. The news that Lee was still alive had reached her only a week ago. She had thought she was prepared for anything: grief, disbelief, even indifference, but not this trembling hope that made her feel both alive and terrified. When she saw him through the glass window, her breath caught. Lee, the man she had loved with her whole being, the man she thought she had lost forever. He was sitting there, his hair slightly longer, his gaze distant like a lost child staring at the sea. Sam wanted to call his name, but her voice froze in her throat. She watched him for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. Every step she took toward him felt heavier than the last. Then, it happened. As she approached, the wet floor betrayed her. Her foot slipped, and she gasped softly as her body tilted forward. Before she could fall, 2 strong arms caught her. Lee's reflex was instant, natural, as if some deep instinct guided him. His arms wrapped around her waist protectively, pulling her against his chest. For a moment, time stopped. The rain continued tapping on the window. The wind hummed softly outside, but within those arms, everything fell silent. Sam felt his heartbeat against her cheeks, strong, steady, familiar. Her hands trembled as she clutched his shirt, and tears she had tried so hard to hold back fell freely. Lee looked down at her, confused. Her tears, her warmth, the way she fit perfectly in his embrace, something about it tore at his heart. His brows furrowed. Why do you feel so familiar?" he whispered, almost to himself. Sam bit her lip, unable to speak. Her voice broke when she finally said, "Because maybe your heart still remembers me." He stared at her, lost between confusion and recognition, his hand unconsciously brushing away a strand of wet hair from her face. "Do I know you?" he asked softly. She smiled sadly. "You did. Once." Lee didn't know what to say. He helped her sit down, still feeling a strange pull he couldn't explain. His eyes drifted to her belly, and something inside him clenched. "You're pregnant," he said, his tone barely above a whisper. Sam nodded. "Yes, your husband must be worried," he said automatically, though his voice carried an unexpected bitterness he didn't understand. She lowered her gaze. "He would be if he were still here." Lee said nothing. For reasons he couldn't name, her sadness felt like his own. His chest tightened, his pulse quickened. It was as if every heartbeat was trying to tell him a secret he could almost but not quite remember. When the nurse called his name from across the hall, Lee hesitated before walking away. He turned back one last time. Sam was still sitting there, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes glistening with unspoken pain. And even though he didn't know who she was, his heart whispered her name over and over again. Sam. That night, Lee couldn't sleep. The scent of her hair, the softness of her voice, the warmth of her tears, they followed him into his dreams. He saw flashes of a sunset, of laughter, of 2 hands intertwined. He woke up sweating, clutching his chest, his heart pounding wildly. He didn't know what it meant, but deep down, he felt one thing with absolute certainty: that the moment he held her, something long buried had come alive again. The next morning, Lee woke up earlier than usual. The air outside the rehabilitation center was still cool and misty. and the scent of damp earth filled his lungs as he stepped into the courtyard. He couldn't stop thinking about her, the woman with gentle eyes and trembling lips who had looked at him like he was her entire world. To Sam, that name had been echoing in his mind all night, like a forgotten melody. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face not as she had looked yesterday, but in flashes, standing by a river, laughing under the sunlight, running toward him with joy. Each image faded too quickly, leaving behind only confusion and longing. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the ache in his chest said otherwise. Later that day, Lee walked quietly along the hospital garden path. He wasn't supposed to wander far, but something inside him, something deeper than memory, guided his steps toward the front gate. There, beneath the same gray sky, Sam was standing again, her hand gently resting on her belly, as she spoke softly to the nurse. She turned, and their eyes met. It was an awkward silence, fragile and trembling, like the edge of something about to break. Sam hesitated, unsure if she should approach. She didn't know how to face the man she loved, who now looked at her as a stranger. But when she saw the faint confusion in his eyes, the uncertainty that mirrored her own, she couldn't help but smile. "Lee," she whispered softly, "do you remember anything about us?" He frowned slightly, the sound of his name from her lips stirring something deep inside. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "When I look at you, I feel ... peace and pain, both at the same time." Her heart twisted at his words. "Maybe," she said gently, "that means you still love me, even if your mind has forgotten." Lee looked away, struggling to process her words. "Love," he repeated, almost as if it were a foreign word. "I don't even know who I am completely. How can I love anyone?" Sam smiled through her tears. "Because love doesn't need remembering," she whispered. "It just exists." The wind picked up, brushing against the trees and carrying the faint scent of jasmine. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, two souls connected by something unseen but deeply felt. As the nurse called to Sam's name to remind her of her appointment, she turned to leave. But before walking away, she took something from her bag, a small silver chain with a ring attached. She placed it in Lee's hand. "You gave this to me," she said softly, "before you left for Cambodia." Lee looked down at the ring. The touch of it sent a wave of warmth through him, then pain. A flicker of memory flashed before his eyes, to Sam laughing under a streetlight, slipping the ring into her palm as he promised, "I'll come back." His breath caught. He pressed the ring to his chest as she disappeared down the hall. That night, Lee sat by the window, staring at the ring in his hand. His heart beat faster, faster, and tears he didn't understand welled in his eyes. He didn't remember their story, but his heart was beginning to remember her. Days turned into weeks, and though Lee's memory still refused to return, something within him began to change. The emptiness that once filled his mind was now replaced by a quiet restlessness, a pull toward something, or rather, someone. He began to see Sam more often. Sometimes at the hospital garden, sometimes near the old oak bench by the lake. She didn't always notice him, but he watched her from a distance, afraid to disturb the fragile peace she carried. Her every movement seemed to calm him, the way she held her belly tenderly, the way she closed her eyes when the wind brushed against her face, as if whispering a prayer.
One afternoon, he found the courage to approach. "To Sam," he said quietly, his voice uncertain. She turned, surprised. Her face lit up with that gentle warmth he couldn't forget. "Lee, you came. I wanted to see you," he admitted, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I don't know why, but when I am near you, everything feels right."
Sam smiled softly. "Then maybe your heart is guiding you home." Her words struck something deep in him. He looked up at her, eyes searching her face for answers he couldn't name. "Home," he repeated faintly, as though testing the word. "Maybe that's what you are." Tears glistened into Sam's eyes. She wanted to tell him everything about their love, their dreams, and the promise they made before he left for his mission. But she stopped herself. He was fragile, lost between past and present. Forcing him to remember might hurt him even more. So instead, she said quietly, "Would you like to walk with me?" They walked slowly along the path by the lake, where the late afternoon sun turned the water golden. The air smelled faintly of lotus and rain. Sam's steps were careful, one hand on her belly. Lee walked beside her, his hand occasionally brushing hers, and every time their skin touched, a spark of memory flickered in his heart. Without realizing it, he began to hum a tune. Soft, familiar. Sam froze. That melody, it was their song, the one he used to hum to her every night before bed. Her tears fell before she could stop them. Lee noticed and turned to her, confused. "Why are you crying?" She smiled through her tears. "Because you still remember, even if you think you don't." He frowned, staring at her for a long moment. Then, gently, he reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek. "I don't know who I was," he whispered, "but I know I never want to see you cry." At that moment, something cracked open inside him, not a full memory, but a feeling, a deep, aching love that refused to die. As the sun sank behind the horizon, painting the world in amber and rose, Lee felt it, that invisible thread connecting them. He didn't need words or memories to understand it. Love had never left. It had simply been waiting. Quietly, faithfully, within the silence of his forgotten heart. That night, the sky trembled with thunder. The rain poured down endlessly, beating against the windows of the hospital where Sam had gone for her final checkup. Lee had been waiting for her by the gate, restless, uneasy. Something in his chest felt wrong, a sharp pulse of fear he couldn't explain. Minutes turned into hours. The storm grew stronger. And then he heard it, the hurried voices of nurses running past him. The pregnant woman in room 207. She fainted. Lee froze. His breath stopped. Without thinking, he ran inside. His heart was pounding so loudly he could hear it echo in his ears. When he entered the room, his world collapsed. Sam lay on the bed, pale and fragile, her breathing weak. Her hand rested protectively over her swollen belly. The sight tore through him like lightning. His knees went weak, and before he knew it, he was by her side, clutching her cold fingers in both of his hands. Sam, his voice cracked. "Please, wake up." The doctor tried to push him aside, but Lee couldn't move. He held her hand tighter, tears spilling freely. And then it happened. A flash. 1,000 flashes. Her laughter under the rain. Their promise beneath the temple lanterns. The night he kissed her goodbye before his mission. The ring, the words, "I'll come back for you." Every moment came rushing back like a flood breaking through a dam. Lee gasped, his heart trembling violently. Sam, he whispered, his tears falling onto her hand. I remember everything." At that very moment, her fingers twitched weakly, her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him crying beside her, she smiled, tired but radiant. "You came back," she whispered. He bent down, pressing his forehead against hers, his voice shaking. "I never really left. Even when my mind forgot you, my heart never did." The rain softened outside, the thunder fading into a calm rhythm. In that quiet room, with her hand in his and their child safe within her, love returned, not as something lost and found, but as something eternal. Because even when memory fades, love remembers.